The phenomenon began without warning, a ripple in the fabric of reality that no philosopher or scientist could adequately explain. It started in the crowded markets of a coastal city, where a merchant strayed shadow, stretched thin across the cobblestones at noon, simply rose. It detached from his heels with a soft, tearing sound, like silk pulled from a splinter, and stood, a flat, featureless silhouette of a man, trembling on the ground. The merchant screamed, but the shadow did not attack. It simply stood, as if tasting its own existence for the first time, before slinking away into an alley. Within a week, the severances were happening everywhere. A seamstress watched her shadow drift up the wall of her shop like spilled ink. A soldiera Eurostrade's shadow broke away during a parade, marching in the opposite direction with a silent, mocking precision. Panic was the first global currency, followed swiftly by a bewildered, pervasive dread. For Alara, it happened in the quiet of her own home, a place she had always considered a sanctuary. She had been reading by the firelight, her shadow a familiar, anchored companion dancing on the stone wall behind her. She felt it first as a strange lightness, a subtle absence, and then she saw it peel away like a decal, sliding down the wall and pooling on the hearthrug. It had her silhouette, her posture, but it was devoid of her essence. Her shadow, which she Eurostrade never named nor truly seen, rose and tilted its head as if listening to a sound only it could hear. Ilara, a pragmatic woman who believed in the measurable world, found her voice trapped in her throat. It didn't Eurostrade look at her with malice. It looked through her, as if she were the ghost. Then, it stepped over the threshold of her front door, which had been firmly shut, and vanished into the moonlit street, leaving her feeling unnervingly light, incomplete, and terrifyingly whole all at once. In the weeks that followed, society fractured. The unshadowed, the riven as they came to be called, were a population gripped by a profound, limbic grief. Without their shadows, they felt a constant, low-level vertigo, a sense of being less real, less substantial. They cast no shade, stood out in sunlight like figures in a poorly rendered painting, and were often shunned by those still haunted or blessed by their own tethered silhouettes. Governments fell as leaders. Their authority literally diminished, were deemed unfit. The shadows themselves formed their own silent communities in the forgotten places, abandoned subway tunnels, the deep shade of ancient forests, the spaces between city buildings where sunlight never reached. They did not speak, for they had no mouths, but they communicated through fluid shifts in form, a language of shape and texture. They reenacted scenes from the lives they Eurostrade left, pantomimes of loves and labors, but with a chilling, objective distance, as if studying the species they Eurostrade emerged from. Ilara, now riven, became an anthropologist of this new world, her scientific mind a shield against her own creeping emptiness. She studied the shadow enclaves from a respectful distance, documenting their formations, their apparent hierarchies, their silent rituals. She saw shadows that had belonged to cruel men acting with a gentleness their originators never possessed, and shadows of the kind-hearted pooling in corners with a cold, nihilistic indifference. There was no moral correlation. Severance, she theorized, was not a judgment but a liberation of a suppressed self, not the conscious self, but the aggregate of all that was denied, the silent potential of a life unlived. Her own shadow, she noted in her meticulous journal, had been a quiet, obedient one. Now it was free, and as she watched a group of shadows flow together like a liquid congregation in an abandoned cathedral one foggy dawn, she realized her quiet grief was no longer for her lost appendage, but for the stranger it had become. Ilara Eurostrade's research took on an obsessive quality, as if by cataloging the shadows she could fill the hollow space her own had left behind. She traveled between enclaves, a ghost among ghosts, her notebook filled with sketches of their fluid formations and theories scribbled in the margins. In the abandoned districts of a city called Vieras, she found a shadow that had once belonged to a brutal warlord now tending a grove of dying saplings with patient, gentle hands. In the deep woods, she discovered a congregation of shadows reenacting weddings and funerals with a grace their originals had never mustered. Yet for all her observations, she could not find her own. It was as if it had dissolved into the world, or worse, as if it had always been waiting for this freedom and had no desire to be found. The phantom tether she had felt in the beginning grew faint, and with its fading came a new terror, that she might forget what it felt like to be whole. It was in a mountain village called Talvath that she encountered the first shadow who spoke, not with words, but with images pressed directly into her mind, a form of communication the Riven had begun to call casting. This shadow had belonged to a poet, and it moved across the wall of a crumbling library, projecting scenes in rapid succession: a woman walking alone through a field of wheat, a child laughing as rain soaked her clothes, a pair of hands releasing a bird into an open sky. Ilara understood immediately. The poet had lived a life of constraint, of duty, of words unspoken. His shadow had become all the poems he never wrote. When the casting ended, the shadow pointed a limb toward the horizon, toward the jagged peaks where the snow never melted. Ilara felt a spark reignite in her chest, the tether, faint but unmistakable, pulling her east. Her shadow, she realized, had not dissolved. It had been waiting for her to stop looking through a lens and start seeing with her heart. The journey into the mountains was brutal. The Riven who accompanied her seekers, all, each chasing their own severed half, fell away one by one, defeated by cold or fear or the creeping realization that their shadows did not wish to be found. Ilara pressed on, driven by something she could no longer name. The air grew thin, and her own body began to feel like a borrowed thing, insubstantial as the shadows she studied. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and still she climbed. On the third night, she reached a plateau where the moon hung so large it seemed to touch the peaks. There, in a basin of stone, she found them, hundreds of shadows, gathered in a spiral, their forms shifting in perfect synchrony. At the center of the spiral stood a single silhouette, smaller than the others, its edges soft and familiar. It was hers. It had been waiting. She did not approach immediately. She sat at the edge of the basin and watched as her shadow moved within the spiral, not as a prisoner, but as a participant in something ancient and profound. The shadows flowed together, merging and separating, telling the story without sound. Ilara saw herself in that story, not her life as she had lived it, but her life as it might have been. She saw the child she had been too serious to be, the lover she had been too cautious to take, the artist she had been too logical to become. Her shadow had been carrying these possibilities all along, a silent keeper of her abandoned selves. And now it was showing her that she could not simply take them back. She had to earn them. The spiral began to slow, and her shadow turned toward her. In the language of casting, it asked a single question: are you ready to become the person you were always meant to be? Ilara stepped into the spiral without hesitation, and the shadows parted like water before her. When she reached the center, her shadow rose to meet her, and for a moment they stood face to faceless face, two halves of a single existence separated by months of grief and distance. Then her shadow moved forward, not to reclaim its place at her feet, but to wrap around her like a second skin. The sensation was nothing like the severance, where that had been a tearing. This was a weaving, threads of darkness threading themselves through the fabric of her being, stitching the lost possibilities back into her soul. She felt the artist Eurostrade's hunger, the lover Eurostrade's vulnerability, the child Eurostrade's unbridled joy, each sensation a small death and a larger rebirth. When it was over, she opened her eyes to find the basin empty. The other shadows had departed, their own integrations complete or abandoned. She was alone beneath the enormous moon, and she cast a shadow once more. But it was not the same. Her new shadow moved with an independence that was not defiance but partnership. When she walked, it sometimes lingered, tracing patterns on the ground before catching up. When she slept, she would wake to find it standing at the window, watching the stars with what she could only describe as curiosity. The phantom tether was gone, replaced by something she had no name for, a quiet conversation that happened beneath language, beneath thought. She descended from the mountains transformed, not into a woman who had retrieved what was lost, but into a woman who had become what she had always refused to be, incomplete by design, a work in progress. A self that was not a fixed point but a fluid collaboration between light and dark. The world she returned to was still fractured, but she found that her understanding had shifted. The Riven she met no longer seemed pitiable to her. They were people standing at the threshold of their own becoming, though most did not know it. She began to teach, not as a scientist but as a guide, helping others trace the tethers they had dismissed as grief or madness. Some found their shadows waiting in quiet places, patient and forgiving. Others found that their shadows had built new lives, new identities, and had no desire to reunite, and in that refusal, both learned a different kind of wholeness. Ilara established no school, wrote no book. She simply walked from settlement to settlement, her shadow moving beside her like a sister, and told her story to anyone who would listen. She called it not a tale of loss but one of liberation, a reminder that what walks beside us is not a servant but a witness, and that to deny it is to live only half a life. In her final years, she returned to the coastal city where the severance had first occurred. The markets were quieter now, the people a mix of riven, shadowed, and a new generation born after the severance who had never known a world where shadows were bound. Ilara sat on the same cobblestones where that first merchant had lost his silhouette, and she watched the sunset paint the streets in shades of gold and amber. Beside her, her shadow stretched long and dark, and then, of its own accord, it rose and walked a few paces ahead, turning back to face her. In the language of casting, it showed her an image, an old woman sitting on warm stones, a shadow standing before her, and between them a light that was neither day nor night, but something in between. "We did well," the image seemed to say. Ilara smiled, and her shadow returned to her feet, not as a servant, but as a companion settling beside an old friend. The world had not returned to what it was, and she was grateful for that. Some things, once unbound, should never be tethered again.